For many years, Central American migrants have been collectively traveling through Mexico to the U.S. via caravans. In recent times, migrant caravans have become a fixture of U.S. media coverage, particularly in election years. Today, we're talking to Delphine Schrank, a Mexico City-based journalist who traveled with several migrant caravans from Central America through Mexico. Delphine, I think there's a lot of misconceptions and some mystery surrounding what exactly migrant caravans are and how they function. Let's start off there. What is a migrant caravan?
So the caravans in this part of the world, Mexico, Central America, have been an ongoing phenomenon for years. They just were never noticed. They never rose to the level that they did under the Trump administration when they really grew in size, for reasons we can get into. But effectively, they were once a year, a lot of migrants showing up at the southern Mexico border. And there, many of them would gather and try to walk north to the US together from Central America or elsewhere, when you're trudging as an undocumented migrant is so perilous because of corruption among local immigration officials, but also because of cartels and various criminals. It's very, very dangerous to take that route alone. And it's thousands of miles north. So walking together, moving together as a big group, as a caravan of people was a self-protection mechanism, nothing more, because it's harder to get raped as a female when you're in a group of, you're a bigger group. It really comes down to that. What happened is that the very first caravan that really made it into the news, I was there 2 days before Trump started tweeting about it, which is what launched it into the stratosphere of international news. That was in April 2018. And I was sitting in the office of Reuters in Mexico City, and I was looking at this caravan forming in southern Mexico. And curiously, there were about 66% more Hondurans than they had been years before. And I thought, that's weird. I'm hearing there are many more. The year before, there had been very contested elections and violent elections in Honduras, protests in the street, allegations of fraud. And I was curious if this was a political reaction. So I went down there, and what happened is that, yes, effectively, you had a lot more people fleeing Honduras, but also Guatemala and El Salvador because of many conditions. And suddenly this hit the news, and it reached the level of Trump hearing about this. And at the same time, because it was a much bigger group of people, the Mexicans hadn't yet shut down a group of people heading north. And so they allowed this caravan to move forward. And this was a new administration in Mexico. And then you had the phenomenon of the huge caravan that you're mentioning, which actually started in October, the so-called exodus from Central America. And it became this kind of phenomenon because people in Central America figured out quite quickly, wow, this might be a great way to get north.
Why are these folks leaving in Central America? I'm sure there's many reasons, but what are two or three?
What happened in the last 10, people sort of said it around 2014, but a bit before, is that conditions in the northern triangle of Central America, so that's El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, started getting really bad in an interlocking way. So it's hard to separate just crime and just poverty and just corruption. They're all interlocking. When you talk to people, when you investigate their lives, as I have done, everything piles on top of everything else. And conditions started getting really, really bad. And so the result is you had the profile of the person who was arriving at the US-Mexico border changed. You started to have a lot more families, a lot of unaccompanied minors, and a lot of women and children, effectively, from Central America, no longer Mexican single men. The reality is that people who are seeking asylum, genuinely fleeing because they fear for their lives. And you have spiraling cycles of deep, deep poverty and lack of hope.
If we fix the governance problem in Latin America, Central America, if we make it more hospitable, more democratic, more secure, this will fix the migration problem. Do you see that is in any way reasonable to think that we could accomplish something like that and that it would have any sort of sustainable dent in the flow of migrants, north?
Yes, is the short answer. The question then is how and over what long period are you planning to do this? Because as I have come to realize just by reading all the researchers and the observations, the great observers nowadays, the consensus is effectively that the system itself in some of these countries is so fundamentally broken that the institutions themselves reward political obeisance. They don't reward service in the service of public interest.
what would a policy be, to help curb this issue or create some stability, a little bit of safety? Have you had any good discussions about how the U.S. or the West in particular could make this work better?
Yes, I think, it's hard because it requires a long-term vision and a long-term commitment, which, given the 4-year electoral cycle, makes it really tricky. But there are many things that the US can do that also they've tried, and and others have tried at the individual levels, that could have measurable effects in some of the worst places. It's not that hard to do. These are tiny countries. You can also, there's plenty of documentation. Where are most people leaving from? Well, what's going on there? Maybe it's an agricultural issue. Climate change has brutally affected an agricultural industry. Well, maybe they need a bit more help to figure out how to deal with drought. Because the reality humanly is most people, most of the time, do not want to abandon everything they know, even if it's dire. They really don't. I meet this all the time. Plenty more people stay in hellish conditions than leave.
You just mentioned drought, excessive weather. How is it there, and how does that affect in terms of migration? Is that part of this component of why situations are so dire?
Yes. As one of the ministers for dealing with 2 massive unprecedented hurricanes said to me last year in Central America, we are the photographic image of climate change here on the Isthmus.
And this is Honduras, right?
It is Honduras, but all of Central America was affected, but northern Honduras was the worst affected. You had back-to-back hurricanes 13 days apart that slammed into the Isthmus, Category 4, Category 5. Meteorologists who have looked at this say we've never seen that degree of intensifying storms, hurricanes, that late in the year, that close together. Extreme phenomena happened. What happened? The result is, in rural areas, you had landslides, you had sort of slippage you had mudslides, all that sort of stuff. In the city, in the sort of great industrial zones, you had infrastructure that completely collapsed, a river system that fell to pieces. Why? Well, unprecedented weather, certainly. But that was basically foreseeable, and I documented how, years of effective mismanagement, politicalization of choices, under-resourcing, because these are very poor countries, made it such that they couldn't even develop the correct infrastructure to prevent the river system in the San Pedro Sula area from overflowing when there were just a lot of rains because of the hurricanes. And that's what led to catastrophic flooding. And guess what? People who had worked their whole lives to build... I remember a wonderful family I met who work on banana plantations on the edge of San Pedro Sula, the second biggest city. They'd spent 12 years working in Chiquita banana plants to finally build their own little beautiful home one-bedroom house. All that remained of it after these hurricanes was a little bright blue toilet, and crying their eyes out. And the wife said to me, maybe we should just leave. Other people around her were thinking of taking a caravan. But no, they stayed, and I watched them as they hammered together whatever they could, to try to build their lives back. But that's what they're facing. Again, I think the message I got was people don't want to leave if they don't have to. They just need a bit of help.
I was thrilled to get to talk to you because you're one of the only people that's actually been in a caravan. You've experienced it. You know what that is about. I think for an American to tell them, hey, I want you to pick up everything that you can carry and walk across a continent, basically, in extreme climate, extreme situations, don't know where you're going really, right? You have no real destination other than the U.S., which is a big place. So what is it like being in one of those caravans?
What you basically see is that, a bunch of people, a lot of young men, but a lot of families, mothers with kids, are carrying whatever they can just on their back, light amount, and they just go. They get on a bus if they're lucky, and then they walk maybe 30 miles a day from one stop to the next to the next. Everyone would sleep out on the roads. They would rely on the goodwill of people around them. And in southern Mexico, I saw a lot of goodwill until suddenly there wouldn't be. Like a town that had been destroyed in an earthquake 2 years before, literally was still rubble, called Zanatapec. They opened up everything. They were cooking tamales and feeding their brothers from Central America. It was really hard. I mean, it's really, people would drop out, head back. And as the caravans, particularly after the October 2018 one, which was right before the US election, midterms, as the caravans became such a huge deal and there was such a perception on the US side, fanned by politicians in Washington and certain elements of the press that these were, invaders, hordes of criminals coming to the US when it was actually people fleeing them. And the numbers that each time have made it to the top, to the US border, have gotten lower and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller.
So let's kind of focus on that. You get to the border, you're part of a migrant caravan, and then two things kind of happen, right? You could be deported, essentially, and then they're in the asylum process, and let's say you make it all the way up there, and I've seen some of the footage from that where people are being deported back. What happens then? What do they do when they made this arduous journey? It's not like they can just cut right around and go back home. So what does that look like then?
Well, so policies were quite severe under the Trump administration, as we all know. So things are slightly different now, but not terribly. I'll tell you what I saw, say, with the first caravan. A lot of, when basically they managed to get to Tijuana, and a lot of them wanted to seek asylum. They got to Tijuana, and those who wanted to seek asylum were camping out on the plaza just over a bridge. It's a pedestrian bridge between Tijuana and San Diego, sort of southern Mexico. And they would wait their turn until they were allowed through and over the bridge, and they would ask for asylum. And US border officials are obligated by law to ask certain questions of these individuals, which effectively boil down to, are you afraid to return home to your country? And if you say yes, then they're obligated to put you through the asylum process to begin it, where an asylum officer will then conduct an interview with you. Eventually, it might be days later, it might be weeks later, in which they ask you questions to make sure that that fear that you've expressed is credible. Do you have credible fear? And then you're meant to be held in effectively one of the American detention centers all along the border. Some are privately run, sort of effectively by the same people that run, criminal prisons. And you're handed over from CPP to ICE, Immigration Customs and Enforcement. And then you're held, and you're meant to be held until a judge effectively rules on whether you have asylum or not. That's what's meant to happen. What began to happen under the Trump administration, which was so committed to stopping that, is that they started to basically break down the asylum process in whatever way they could. The most sensational and frankly horrible one among the many was this policy of child separation, zero tolerance it was called, where in 2018, and I started to see this, in Tijuana in April 2018, you started to get glimmers of this. People arriving with their kids at the border, their children would be ripped from their arms, whether they were babies or not, if they were coming into the US, and separated from them. And then those parents would, and I found several, be deported back to their countries having no idea where their kids were. They were all sent back to camps, to the border zones of US-Mexico border. And some of those zones are the worst, most dangerous zones for Mexicans and Central Americans because they're completely overrun by cartels, the worst of the worst. And we're talking a lap swim over the Rio Grande in Tamaulipas state, where you have the two different cartels fighting it out and different factions and executing people and throwing their heads into the street. I mean, it's brutal. And so what were people supposed to do? They were supposed to wait until they could get their hearing in the US side. And so you effectively had the development of de facto refugee camps where people were squeezed up against the border to protect themselves again in tents and relying on the goodwill of Americans too, who came over giving them food to protect themselves. I remember a wonderful family who'd fled a massacre on their valley tiny road in Honduras. And 1,000 reasons. They had all the documentation showing how their colleague was shot dead, this, that, and the other. Living in one of these tent cities in Matamoros on the border with Brownsville, Texas, and on the tent, and this is a boiling hot concrete bit of road, and they would stay up all night because they couldn't sleep. But the mother and the father would alternate staying up because they were afraid their kids would be snatched from the tent at night. And that was MPP, which has been contested. The Biden administration immediately tried to eliminate it. And since COVID happened, another way the Trump administration tried to stop people arriving, the Northern Triangle immediately shut their borders because they knew how devastated their hospital systems would be if they got one COVID infected patient. But anyway, you still had people going north. And the US put in place something called Title 42, in which effectively they allowed everyone at the border to be, the border patrol to immediately expel within 2 hours anyone who arrived. And so as a result, anyone who has any claim whatsoever wasn't even considered. They were just sent back to Mexico. And another thing that happens is when people apply for asylum, when they're deported from the US, it's considered a criminal offense. such that they're given a paper that says you cannot return to the US for 5-10 years. Whereas in Mexico, they're not. It's a civil offense. So they can come into Mexico as many times as they want. But the way deportation happens, because Mexico is such a huge country, if they're sent back from the border of the US into Mexico, they can basically stay in these incredibly dangerous zones for themselves, knowing that they themselves are targets of cartels and other trafficking groups that know they can make money off trafficking human beings. Or they can make their way all the way back down south to Mexico, thousands of miles, to one of the poorest districts of Mexico, Chiapas and all the states around it, Tabasco, where there's also crime. Try to get a humanitarian visa or the equivalent of asylum in Mexico. And that's its own process. And what Mexico has actually seen is that their own asylum numbers have kept, of people applying for asylum, all from Central America, have shot up and up and up and up exponentially every year. And for me, those numbers are almost more significant than the ones at the US border, because those are people that are committed. It's not about the dream of the US necessarily. It's about getting out of their country. There's this tiny little refugee, which again, I'm surprised that American policymakers don't study this more. You got in Mexico, the way it works, you got immigration, the immigration office. So someone like me who's a gringo, who's an American, like when I come into the country, if you're coming as an American tourist, you get stamped at the border, you get your visa for 6 months as a tourist or whatever. But if you want to apply for asylum, you apply to this refugee agency, which at one point was staffed by 24 people. And they've had exponential numbers of people coming into the country. They had 3 offices nationwide. They don't go through the judicial system. They're the ones that have to interview people and give them an answer within 45 to 90 days. I mean, they're overwhelmed. The immigration system in Mexico itself is kind of overwhelmed and really difficult. The shelter system, the sort of shelters you have in cities around the country for migrants, the ones particularly at the US-Mexico border, were meant to receive Mexicans who were being sent back, maybe after years in the US illegally. They were not designed for people going the other way with Central Americans. And when you go to these shelters, they tend to all be run by pastors, and wherever they are in the country, they're all completely overwhelmed.
So one thing I wanted to ask you about inside these caravans, and now you've traced the route, where they come from and why they leave, the dangers they choose. There's kind of a 2-part question I wanted to ask you. When they leave, do they understand the risk of what's going to happen? Is there a feedback loop where people go before them, they go to the border in the US, they hear how it went and it relays back? Or is that totally doesn't matter? Like the conditions are so dire, the risks are worth it. And do they know what they're getting themselves into and how it can play out when they depart wherever they're at, whether it's Honduras or Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, and they're going north? Do they know what the risks are and they still are making that decision to go ahead and try and do it?
Yes, they do know. I mean, I think for the most part, the reality is things get really bad and then they have no choice. People don't really care about US politics. They don't know anything about it. They don't care. What they know is that maybe they have a relative who's in the US somewhere. They wouldn't be able to place them on a map, Texas, something, they've heard of the places. But conditions are so bad, your choice is between a rock and a hard place. So you might as well take the risk and flee.
What's the death rate? When you look at these caravans and they're taking a massive risk, is there any sense of how many people never make it and pay with their life with this gamble of just coming to the United States?
There's so many regions of the country where no one was reporting deaths. No one was reporting, criminal assaults, and corpses weren't showing up at the morgue, so they couldn't really count them. I think ABC had recently this year documented that the number of body remains that were found at the US-Mexico border were like 465 this year from the US side. So they've gone up, but it's a hard thing to measure.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating when we're talking about COVID deaths a lot. That's something that we have our hands around. We can count that. We're tracking it. There's a lot of people paying attention to it. I feel like this is just a complete unknown, and if we knew, it would be horrifying, to imagine. Delphine, in terms of this, is another statistics question in a way, but the narrative that is preached by politicians in certain places is these folks are criminals. They come in the United States and they just immediately resort to crime or criminals. Is there any truth to that or not?
while there's a real security fear and it's legitimate at the US border, it's certainly not true that the majority of these people are criminal. I mean, if anything, it's the other way around, it is definitely the other way around. It's very, very hard for those bad eggs to get through.
That was Delphine Schrank, a migration reporter based in Mexico City. I hope you enjoyed this series of conversations on migration and the way it ties into national security. Thanks to Aaron Stein and to you, the listeners of Chain Reaction, for this opportunity to come and guest host. This episode was produced by Sophia James and Sophia Kurzius. I'm Clint Watts at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and you can follow me on Twitter at the username @SelectedWisdom. Thanks for listening.